The first night I slept in the house, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing in the hallway. Not footsteps, not the house settling. Breathing. Slow. Patient. Close enough that it sounded like whoever it was had stopped just outside my bedroom door. When I opened my eyes, the hallway light was on. I hadn't turned it on before going to bed, and I knew that because the switch was on the other side of the hallway. The door to my room was slightly open, and in the narrow crack between the door and the frame, I could see something moving. Not a full figure, just a shadow passing slowly back and forth, like someone pacing in the hall. I remember lying completely still, staring at the thin slice of light cutting across the floor, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Houses make strange noises at night. Old buildings shift, pipes knock. But breathing is different. Breathing has rhythm. Whoever was outside my door was standing there long enough that I started noticing something else. The shadow didn't look like it was moving away. It looked like it was leaning closer to the door, as if whoever was in the hallway was trying to listen to what I was doing inside the room. I didn't open the door that night, and looking back now, that was probably the only reason I stayed alive long enough to understand what was actually happening inside that house. Because the truth is, I didn't move into that place by accident. I chose it. The house had been listed online for months before I ever saw it. A 2-story property at the edge of a quiet town, priced far below anything else in the area. At first, I assumed something had to be wrong with it. Structural damage, legal issues, maybe the kind of problems you only discover after signing paperwork. But the longer I looked into it, the stranger the listing started to feel. Because the house hadn't just been sitting on the market. It had been sold over and over again. And every person who bought it left within a year. Most of them lasted far less than that. At the time, I thought it was a coincidence. A strange pattern, maybe. Bad luck for the owners. But after spending even one night there, I realized something that made the whole situation much worse. Those people hadn't left because they wanted to. They left because eventually they realized they weren't the only ones living there. The first thing that made the house stand out wasn't the price. It was the ownership history. When I first saw the listing online, I did what most people do when something looks too good to be true. I checked the property records. Most houses change owners, maybe once every decade or two. Sometimes longer. This one had changed owners 9 times in the last 10 years. At first, I assumed it had been used as a rental property or flipped by investors. But the more I dug into it, the less that explanation made sense. Every transfer was a full sale, different buyers every time. Regular people, not companies, and none of them stayed very long. One family sold the house after only 6 months. Another owner left after 4. The longest anyone had ever lived there was just under a year. Then the house would go back on the market again. Same listing photos, same short description, almost no details. It wasn't until I contacted the real estate agent that I realized something else about the situation felt off. She didn't try very hard to sell it. Normally, when someone shows interest in a property, agents start pushing immediately, offering showings, discussing offers, asking about financing. This time, the woman on the phone sounded almost hesitant. She answered my questions politely enough, but there was a strange pause whenever I mentioned actually visiting the place. Eventually, she told me the house was still available if I wanted to see it. But before we ended the call, she said something that stuck with me, not in a dramatic way, just casually, almost like an afterthought. She told me the previous owner had moved out very suddenly. When I asked why, she didn't give a clear answer. Instead, she explained that the man who lived there before me had contacted her one evening, saying he needed to sell the property immediately. No renovations, no negotiations, just list it. Apparently, he had packed most of his belongings into his truck and left town the same night. He never came back for the rest. At the time, I assumed there had been some kind of personal issue. Divorce, financial trouble, something along those lines. But when I finally drove out to see the house in person, something about the property made that explanation feel less convincing. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't neglected. In fact, the house looked like someone had been living there right up until the moment they left. The lawn had been cut recently. The curtains were still hanging in the windows. Even the porch light was on. But the driveway was empty. And the front door was unlocked. The real estate agent had told me she would meet me there later that afternoon. But when I stepped inside the house for the first time, I had the strange feeling that someone had already been there long before I arrived, because the hallway light was on. And I was certain no one else had entered the house that day. The inside of the house was quieter than I expected. Not the comfortable kind of quiet you find in empty places, but the kind where every small movement feels louder than it should. My footsteps echoed faintly across the wooden floor as I stepped into the entryway, and for a moment I just stood there, listening. The hallway light above me hummed softly. That was the first thing that struck me as strange. If the previous owner had really left in such a hurry, it seemed odd that electricity was still running, and lights had been left on. Usually when people abandon a place, the power gets shut off. But everything in the house was still working. The living room was mostly empty except for a single couch pushed against the far wall. A thin layer of dust had started settling on the furniture, but not enough to suggest the house had been empty for long. What caught my attention more were the small things left behind. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter, a pair of shoes near the back door, a stack of unopened mail sitting beside the refrigerator. It looked less like someone had moved out and more like someone had stepped outside for a moment and never returned. As I walked through the kitchen, I noticed something written on the calendar hanging on the wall. Most of the dates were blank except for a few notes scribbled in pencil. Normal things at first. Trash pickup, electric bill, dentist. But as I scanned down toward the final week, the handwriting changed. The letters looked rushed, uneven, like whoever wrote them had been in a hurry. 3 short sentences were written across 3 different days. He's still here. Lights again. Don't open the door. I stared at those words longer than I should have. At the time, I told myself it was probably a joke, or maybe some kind of note left by the previous owner during a stressful moment. People write strange things when they're tired or anxious. Still, I couldn't ignore the way the words made the quiet house feel different. As if the silence around me wasn't empty at all. I finished walking through the first floor and eventually climbed the staircase to the second level. There were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all of them mostly cleared out except for a few pieces of forgotten furniture. But when I reached the end of the hallway, I found something that didn't match the rest of the house. The final bedroom door was closed. Every other door upstairs had been left open. And when I tried the handle, I discovered it was locked. That might not have meant anything on its own, but there was something else about the door that bothered me. Several deep scratches ran across the wood near the handle. Not small marks, long, uneven gouges. I was still staring at those scratches when I heard something downstairs. A soft sound, like a floorboard shifting under someone's weight. And I suddenly realized something that made the entire house feel colder. The real estate agent hadn't arrived yet, which meant someone else had just walked inside. I stood in the hallway for several seconds listening. The house had gone completely still again. At first I thought maybe I'd imagined the sound. Old houses shift in strange ways, especially when the temperature changes. Wood expands, floorboards settle, pipes knock inside the walls. But the noise I had heard downstairs hadn't sounded like the house settling. It had sounded like a footstep. Slow, careful. I moved toward the top of the staircase and looked down into the darkened entryway below. From where I stood, I could see the front door and the living room beyond it. Nothing was moving. The hallway light downstairs was still on, casting a dull yellow glow across the floor. For a moment, I considered calling out, just to see if someone answered. Maybe the agent had arrived earlier than expected. Maybe someone from the property office had stopped by to check something. But something about the quiet house made me hesitate. Instead of speaking, I slowly walked down the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing louder than I liked. By the time I reached the bottom, my eyes had adjusted enough to see the entire first floor clearly. Everything looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes earlier. The couch hadn't moved. The kitchen was still empty. The front door was closed. But when I stepped into the entryway, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The door lock had been turned. It was a small detail, easy to overlook, but I knew the position it had been in when I first entered the house. Unlocked. Now the deadbolt was halfway twisted, as if someone had just tried to secure it. The problem was, I hadn't touched it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, trying to decide whether I was remembering things incorrectly. It wouldn't have been the first time I'd made a simple mistake while exploring an unfamiliar place, but the more I thought about it, the less convincing that explanation felt. If someone had come inside the house while I was upstairs, they would have had to walk past me to reach the door again. And I hadn't heard anyone leave. I checked the rest of the first floor carefully after that. The kitchen was empty. The back door was still locked from the inside. Every window in the house was closed. No sign of anyone. Eventually, I convinced myself that the noise must have been the house settling after all. By the time the real estate agent arrived, about 20 minutes later, I had almost managed to forget about the strange moment entirely. She walked through the house with me, pointing out things like the recently replaced water heater and the condition of the roof. But during the entire tour, she avoided one part of the house, the second floor hallway. When we finally reached the staircase, she paused at the bottom. Then she told me something that made the back of my neck tighten. She said most of the previous owners had complained about noises upstairs, footsteps in the hallway late at night, doors opening and closing, lights turning on. She told me the same thing every real estate agent says when a property develops a reputation like that. Old houses make strange sounds. But the way she said it felt like she didn't completely believe it herself. And before we left that day, I asked her one final question. Something I hadn't thought much about until that moment. I asked whether the previous owner had mentioned anything unusual before he left. She hesitated for a second before answering. Then she told me he'd said one thing before he packed his truck and drove away. According to him, the house wasn't empty. Someone else had been living there the entire time, and eventually that person started getting closer to his bedroom every night. I wish I could say that hearing that story made me walk away from the house immediately. It probably should have. By the time I drove home that afternoon, my thoughts kept circling back to the same conclusion. Every old property develops rumors eventually. Houses that sit on the market too long attract stories, especially in smaller towns where people enjoy speculating about things they don't fully understand. Footsteps, lights turning on, someone else living there. Those explanations sounded dramatic, but none of them actually proved anything. What they did prove was that the price of the house had dropped far below what property was really worth. A few weeks later, I signed the paperwork. The house officially became mine. Moving in took less time than I expected. The previous owner had left behind very little furniture, which meant most of the rooms were empty by the time I carried the last box upstairs. The only part of the house I didn't change immediately was the final bedroom at the end of the hallway. The one with the scratches around the door handle. The agent had given me the key after closing the sale, but something about the deep gouges in the wood made me postpone opening it right away. Instead, I focused on settling into the rest of the house. For the first few days, everything felt completely normal. I unpacked my belongings, cleaned the rooms, and even started getting used to the quiet of the neighborhood. The town itself was small and calm, the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors during the day. At night, the streets were almost completely silent, and for the first week, the house behaved exactly like any other house, until the lights started turning on. The first time it happened, I assumed I had simply forgotten to turn them off. I had been sitting in the living room watching television when I noticed a faint glow coming from the hallway. When I stood up and looked around the corner, the upstairs light was shining down the staircase. I turned it off without thinking much about it. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the kitchen light was on when I came downstairs in the morning. Then a few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. and noticed a thin strip of light coming from under my bedroom door. The hallway light. I remembered very clearly turning that light off before going to bed. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was simply forgetting things. Moving into a new place can be stressful, and stress does strange things to memory. But the lights weren't the only thing happening. A few days later, I began noticing something else. Footsteps upstairs. The sound was faint at first, easy to mistake for the house settling or pipes moving in the walls. But the longer I lived there, the more certain I became of something disturbing. The footsteps always happened at night, and they always started in the far bedroom at the end of the hallway, the one with the locked door. For almost 2 weeks, I ignored it. I told myself that whatever was happening inside the house had a simple explanation, until the night I finally heard the footsteps stop directly outside my bedroom, and the hallway light turned on again. The footsteps outside my bedroom didn't last long, maybe 5 seconds. Just enough time for the sound to move slowly across the hallway floor before stopping somewhere near my door. Then the house went silent again. I stayed awake for the rest of the night after that, staring at the thin line of light beneath the door and listening for any sign that someone was still out there. Nothing else happened. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that exhaustion had distorted what I heard. Lack of sleep can do strange things to the mind, especially in unfamiliar places. Every small noise becomes exaggerated when the house is quiet enough, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The light switch was flipped up. Someone, or something, had turned it on. That was the morning I finally decided to unlock the room at the end of the hallway. I retrieved the small brass key from the kitchen drawer where I'd left it after closing the sale. The walk upstairs felt longer than usual, and by the time I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed the scratches on the door more clearly than before. They weren't random marks. They all ran outward from the handle, like someone had been trying to get in. I slid the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The door opened with a dry creak. The room behind it was almost completely empty. Dust covered most of the floor, and the air had the stale smell of a space that hadn't been opened in months. A single window faced the backyard, letting in a narrow beam of gray daylight. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just bare walls and a worn carpet. But when I stepped further into the room, I noticed something along the far wall. Several objects had been arranged neatly on the floor. Not furniture, boxes, 5 of them. Each one labeled with a different name written in black marker. I crouched beside the closest box and lifted the lid. Inside were personal belongings, clothes, photographs, a wallet, a set of keys. None of them belonged to the same person. Each box contained the kinds of things someone might pack if they were leaving in a hurry. The disturbing part was the names. They matched the previous owners of the house. Every person who had lived there before me, their things hadn't been taken when they moved out. They had been left behind, organized, stored, almost like someone had been collecting them. And as I slowly counted the boxes again, something else became clear. There were 5 of them in the room. But according to the property records, 9 different people had owned the house, which meant 4 sets of belongings were missing. I was still standing there trying to make sense of that when I heard the sound again. Footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate. And this time, they were moving toward the room where I was standing. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, I didn't move. I was still crouched beside the open box, one hand resting on the lid, while the sound of whoever, or whatever, was standing in the hallway lingered just beyond the frame of the doorway. The house had gone completely quiet again. No breathing, no movement, just silence. Slowly, I stood up and turned toward the door. The hallway light was on again. I could see the pale yellow glow stretching across the floorboards outside the room. But from where I stood, the rest of the hallway was hidden behind the edge of the door frame. If someone had been standing there a few seconds earlier, they had moved away without making a sound, or they were standing somewhere I couldn't see them. I waited a few seconds longer, listening carefully. Nothing. Eventually, I stepped out into the hallway. The corridor was empty. All 3 bedroom doors were open, the same way I'd left them earlier that day. The staircase at the end of the hall was dark, and the living room below it looked just as quiet as the rest of the house. But something had changed. The door to my bedroom was now closed. I knew for a fact I had left it open when I went to investigate the locked room. At first, I assumed the door must have shifted on its own. Old hinges sometimes move when the air pressure changes inside a house. But when I walked closer, I noticed something that made the situation harder to dismiss. The handle was slowly turning. Not quickly, not violently, just a slow, careful movement, like someone on the other side was testing the latch. I stood there watching it for several seconds before the handle stopped. Then the door opened slightly, just a few inches, enough for the darkness inside the room to spill out into the hallway. For a moment, I expected someone to step through the doorway. No one did. Instead, I noticed something else. The bed inside my room had been moved. Not far, but enough that the position was clearly different from the way I'd left it that morning. Someone had been inside the room while I was upstairs. I stepped toward the doorway carefully, every part of me expecting to find someone hiding behind the bed or inside the closet. The room was empty, but when I walked inside, I saw something strange. The closet door was open. I knew I had closed it earlier, and inside the closet, hanging neatly from the metal rod, was something that didn't belong to me. A jacket. Old. Worn. Definitely not something I had brought into the house. At first, I assumed it must have belonged to the previous owner and had simply been overlooked when the house was cleared. But when I checked the pockets, I found something disturbing. Inside the jacket was a wallet. The driver's license inside it had a familiar name. It belonged to the man who had lived in the house before me, the one who had supposedly packed his truck and left town overnight. According to the real estate agent, he had taken all his belongings with him. But his wallet was still here, which meant one of two things had happened. Either he had left without it, or he had never left the house at all. For several minutes, I stood in my bedroom holding the wallet, trying to make sense of what I'd just found. The driver's license photo showed a man in his mid-30s with tired eyes and a faint beard. The name matched the one listed in the property records for the previous owner. There were a few credit cards inside the wallet, along with a folded receipt dated about 3 weeks before the house had gone back on the market. If the real estate agent was telling the truth, this man had packed his things and left town overnight. People don't leave their wallets behind when they do that. At first, I tried to imagine a normal explanation. Maybe the man had lost it somewhere in the house before leaving. Maybe it had slipped behind a piece of furniture and I had only just uncovered it by coincidence. But that theory didn't explain the jacket, or the fact that the closet door had been closed earlier. Someone had placed those things there recently. Someone who had been moving through the house while I was upstairs. The thought of another person living inside the walls or attic crossed my mind. The same explanation people use when they discover strangers secretly occupying abandoned homes. It sounded ridiculous, but it made more sense than the alternative. If someone had been hiding in the house, the first place they would use was the attic. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and returned to the staircase leading to the second floor. The attic hatch was located in the hallway ceiling near the bathroom. A simple square panel with a pull cord hanging down. The cord swayed slightly when I approached it. That might have been the air from my footsteps disturbing it. Or it might have meant the hatch had been open recently. I pulled the cord and the wooden panel dropped down slowly, revealing a narrow ladder leading up into darkness. A wave of stale air drifted down from above, carrying the faint smell of dust and something else I couldn't quite identify. Not rot. Something older. Something dry. I climbed the ladder slowly, shining the flashlight ahead of me. The attic was larger than I expected, stretching across the entire width of the house. Wooden beams ran along the ceiling, and insulation covered most of the floor. At first, the light revealed nothing unusual. Just boxes. Old tools. A few pieces of furniture that had probably been stored there by previous owners. Then the beam of the flashlight reached the far corner, and I saw something hanging from one of the rafters. A rope. Not a loose coil. A loop. Carefully tied. The knot was positioned at about the height of an average person's neck. My first thought was that someone had used the attic for storage and simply left the rope there. But the longer I looked at it, the more unsettling the situation became. because the rope wasn't dusty. It looked newer than everything else in the attic, and directly beneath it, the insulation had been flattened, as if someone had been standing there recently. That was when I heard the sound again. Footsteps. But this time they weren't in the hallway. They were downstairs, moving slowly across the living room floor, and whoever was making them had just walked through the front door. From the attic, the sound of the footsteps downstairs felt strangely clear. Old houses carry noise in unusual ways. The wooden beams above me acted almost like hollow channels, letting every movement from the floor below travel upward through the structure of the building. I switched off the flashlight instinctively. The attic dropped into complete darkness. For several seconds, I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps continued across the living room floor, slow and measured, like someone exploring a place they had never been before. Then they stopped, directly beneath the attic. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise itself. I didn't dare move. Part of me wondered if whoever was downstairs had heard the attic hatch open earlier. If they had seen the ladder hanging down in the hallway, they would know someone else was in the house. Another possibility crept into my mind while I crouched there in the dark. Maybe the person downstairs wasn't surprised at all. Maybe they already knew I was there. A faint sound broke the silence a moment later. The staircase creaked. One step, then another. Whoever had entered the house was now climbing to the second floor. The rhythm of the footsteps was steady, patient, as if the person wasn't in any hurry. I felt a cold tension settle in my chest as the creaking sounds reached the hallway directly outside the attic hatch. The footsteps stopped again. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I heard the hallway light switch click. Even from the attic, I could see the faint glow spreading upward through the small opening around the hatch. Someone was standing right below me, and they had just turned on the light. I held my breath. The ladder was still extended. If the person in the hallway looked up, they would see it immediately. A few seconds passed. Then something brushed against the bottom rung of the ladder. Not a hard movement, just a slow touch, like someone testing whether it was stable. The wood shifted slightly under the pressure. My entire body tensed. If the person started climbing, there would be nowhere for me to go. The attic had no second exit, no windows large enough to escape through. But the climbing never started. Instead, I heard something else. A voice. Very quiet. Almost a whisper. The words were difficult to make out from above, but the tone carried clearly through the ceiling. The person downstairs was speaking as if they were addressing someone. Not loudly, just softly, patiently. And after a moment, I realized something even more disturbing. They weren't talking to me. They were talking to someone else in the house, and the voice said something that made the situation far worse. It said, "Another one finally opened the attic." The whisper drifted up through the attic opening and settled into the silence like something that had been said many times before. Another one finally opened the attic. For several seconds, I stayed frozen where I was, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood the words. Maybe the person downstairs had been talking on a phone. Maybe there was someone else in the house who had entered through the back door. But the voice hadn't sounded like someone speaking into a device. It had sounded like someone addressing a room, or a person standing nearby. The problem was, I had already checked the entire house earlier that afternoon. There hadn't been anyone else there. Slowly, I leaned forward and looked toward the attic hatch. From where I crouched between the rafters, I could see the faint glow of the hallway light spilling upward around the edges of the opening. The ladder shifted slightly again. Another touch from below. This time the movement felt deliberate, testing, waiting. Then the voice spoke again. Calm, patient, almost conversational. It explained that the last owner had lasted longer than most. Nearly 11 months before he finally started noticing the footsteps at night. According to the voice, the man had tried to ignore them for weeks before eventually discovering the attic ladder, the same way I had. The voice paused briefly before continuing. It said that curiosity was always the turning point. People can ignore strange noises for a long time if they believe there is a normal explanation waiting for them. But eventually, everyone wants proof. Everyone wants to see what's making the sounds. That was when most of them stopped sleeping. I could hear faint movement in the hallway as the voice continued talking. Not pacing, just shifting weight slowly from one foot to the other, like someone standing patiently beside the ladder. The explanation continued in the same quiet tone. It said that once people opened the attic and saw what was inside, they usually tried to leave the house soon afterward. Some packed their belongings and drove away that very night. Others stayed longer, convincing themselves they had imagined what they saw. But the result was always the same. They eventually left, except for the ones who didn't. The voice continued. It said that the attic wasn't the real reason people abandoned the house. The rope wasn't the important part. The important part was what lived inside the walls. For a moment, the hallway went silent again. Then the ladder creaked slightly as the person below placed one foot on the first rung and began climbing slowly toward the attic. The ladder groaned quietly under the weight of the person climbing toward the attic. Each step came slowly, with the careful rhythm of someone who had climbed those same rungs many times before. From where I crouched behind a row of wooden beams, I could see the top of the ladder shifting slightly as the climber moved closer. For a moment, I considered trying to escape deeper into the attic, but there was nowhere to go. The attic stretched across the house, but the beams and insulation created narrow paths that led only to dead ends. Whoever was coming up that ladder would reach the floor of the attic within seconds, and then they would see me. The top of a head appeared through the opening first. A man. Older than I expected, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, with thin gray hair and a face that looked strangely calm for someone climbing into a dark attic in the middle of the night. He carried a small flashlight in one hand, though he hadn't turned it on yet. Instead, he paused at the top of the ladder and looked around the attic slowly, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Eventually, his gaze found me. There was no shock in his expression, no surprise, just a quiet kind of recognition, as if he had been expecting to find someone there all along. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he climbed the final step and stepped onto the attic floor. The ladder creaked softly behind him as he turned to face me. Up close, the man looked tired rather than threatening. His clothes were plain, the kind you might see on someone who had lived in the same town their entire life. But there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. Too relaxed, too familiar with the space around him. Finally, he spoke. His voice was the same one I'd heard downstairs. He explained that he wasn't surprised I'd come up here. According to him, every owner eventually did the same thing. Curiosity always wins, especially once people start hearing footsteps in empty hallways. He gestured toward the rope hanging from the rafter. Most of the previous owners had assumed that was the real horror waiting in the attic, a sign that someone had died in the house, or worse. But he told me the rope was just there to give people something to focus on, something simple to fear. The real problem with the house was harder to explain. According to him, the house had a habit. Not a haunting, not a spirit, just a pattern. Over time, people who lived there started noticing the same things. Lights turning on, doors opening, footsteps in the hallways. At first, they assumed someone else was in the house. Eventually, they realized something much worse. The house wasn't empty. It was slowly filling up. And when I asked him what that meant, he gave an answer that made the back of my neck go cold. He said every person who had lived in the house eventually started hearing themselves walking through the hallway at night. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood what the man was saying. Hearing yourself walking through the hallway at night didn't make any sense. Even in a house filled with strange noises and shifting floorboards, there were limits to what the mind could realistically mistake. But the man in the attic spoke about it as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He explained that the first few weeks in the house were always quiet. People moved in, unpacked their belongings, and started settling into a routine. The place felt normal enough during the day. The problem always started after the first month. That was when people began noticing small changes. Lights turning on after they had been switched off, doors opening slightly during the night, footsteps upstairs when no one else was home. At first, every owner assumed the same thing. Someone else must be in the house. Someone hiding in the attic, someone moving through the walls. But that explanation never lasted very long. Eventually, people started noticing something strange about the sounds. The footsteps followed patterns, specific routes through the hallway, the exact same path every night. Bedroom door to staircase, staircase to kitchen, kitchen to living room, then back upstairs again. After enough nights passed, people began recognizing something disturbing about the rhythm of those steps. The pace, the weight, the pauses near certain doors. They sounded familiar, not just similar, identical, because the footsteps always matched the exact way the owner of the house walked through it during the day. The man in the attic told me that realization usually took several weeks to fully sink in. At first, people tried to ignore it, telling themselves they were imagining things. But eventually, they began noticing something worse. Sometimes the footsteps upstairs happened while they were standing downstairs. Other times, the sounds moved through the hallway while they were lying awake in bed, which meant the person walking through the house couldn't possibly be them. At least not the version of them that was awake. The man paused then, glancing toward the attic hatch behind him as if listening for something. When he spoke again, his voice had grown slightly quieter. He said the house didn't create ghosts, it created something else. Over time, every person who lived there began leaving something behind. Not belongings, not memories, versions of themselves. Fragments that continued walking through the house long after the owners tried to leave. That was why the previous owners had abandoned their belongings in the attic room. They thought leaving the house meant leaving those things behind too. But according to the man standing in front of me, they were wrong. Because once the house had a version of you inside it, that version never stopped living there. And sometimes, it started learning how to open doors. For several seconds, I didn't respond. The explanation the man had just given sounded less like a haunting and more like something much harder to understand. Houses can hold strange histories, but the idea that a building could somehow create copies of the people living inside it felt impossible. At least that's what I wanted to believe. But there was a problem with dismissing what he said. I had already heard the footsteps, many times, and I knew exactly how I walked through the house during the day. Slow in the mornings, heavier steps on the staircase, a slight pause near the kitchen doorway where the floorboard dipped slightly under my weight. Those were the exact sounds I had heard at night. The man watched my expression carefully, as if he had seen the same realization forming on other people's faces before. Eventually, he nodded slightly. That was the point where most people started understanding the situation. According to him, the house had been doing this for decades. Every owner who stayed long enough began noticing the same patterns. At first they heard the footsteps, then they began hearing other things. Closet doors opening, water running briefly in the sink downstairs, the sound of someone sitting on the couch in the living room. Little details that matched their own daily habits, the versions of themselves inside the house were learning the routines, learning the layout, learning how the doors worked. That was when most people tried to leave. But leaving didn't always fix the problem. The man told me some of the previous owners had reported hearing those same footsteps weeks after moving away. Late at night in their new homes, in apartments, in hotel rooms, the same slow pace, the same pauses near doorways, as if something had followed them. Eventually, those people stopped reporting anything at all. No one ever confirmed whether the sounds had stopped, or if they had simply stopped talking about them. I asked the man how he knew all this. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the rope hanging from the rafter, studying it quietly for a few seconds. Then he explained that he had once owned the house too. Long before the previous owner, long before me. He had lived there for almost a year before he started hearing the footsteps at night. Just like everyone else, just like me. The difference was that he hadn't tried to run. He had stayed, because eventually he realized something important. The house didn't trap people. People trapped themselves. The longer someone lived there, the more versions of them the house created. And eventually, one of those versions became curious enough to open the attic door. Then he looked directly at me and asked a question that made my chest tighten. He asked if I'd heard the footsteps twice at the same time yet. I didn't answer him right away. Not because I didn't understand the question, because the moment he asked it, a memory surfaced in the back of my mind that I hadn't fully processed at the time. About 3 nights earlier, I had woken up around 2 a.m. to the familiar sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, I had assumed it was the same pattern I had heard before. The slow walk down the hallway, the brief pause near my bedroom door, the quiet shift of weight on the staircase. But that night, something had felt slightly different. The rhythm had been wrong. Not louder, not faster, just layered. At the time, I told myself it was probably an echo bouncing through the hallway. Now I wasn't so sure. The man in the attic watched my face carefully as that realization settled in. He didn't look pleased by it, but he didn't look surprised either. According to him, that was usually the moment when people finally understood how far the process had already progressed. At first, the house created only faint versions of its owners, little echoes moving through familiar routines. But the longer someone lived there, the more detailed those versions became. Eventually, they started overlapping. 2 sets of footsteps, then 3, each one following the same familiar paths through the house, each one repeating the same daily habits, until the difference between the real person and the copies became difficult to recognize. I asked him how many versions the house had created of him. He thought about that question for a moment. Then he said he had stopped counting after the 6th one. The strange part was that the copies didn't appear all at once. They formed slowly over time, like reflections becoming clearer in a mirror. At first, they were only sounds, footsteps in empty hallways, chairs shifting slightly in empty rooms, but eventually they started leaving physical signs behind. Lights turning on, doors opening, objects being moved from one room to another. The man gestured toward the attic hatch behind him. Most people believed the copies stayed inside the house. That was the comforting assumption. But he told me the truth was a little more complicated, because the copies didn't always stay where they were created. Sometimes they wandered, sometimes they learned, and once they understood how the doors worked, they started exploring the rest of the house. Then he said something that made the entire conversation take a darker turn. He said the first time he saw one of his copies standing at the end of the hallway, it had been looking directly at his bedroom door, waiting, studying, learning how he moved, and when I asked him what happened after that, he gave an answer that made the attic feel suddenly smaller. He said eventually one of them started opening the front door at night and walking outside. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The idea that something inside the house could eventually walk outside felt worse than everything else he had described so far. Footsteps in empty rooms were one thing. Strange noises at night could always be explained away if someone tried hard enough. But something opening the front door and leaving the house meant the problem wasn't confined to the walls anymore. It meant the copies weren't trapped. They were learning how to leave. The man seemed to sense where my thoughts were going, because he nodded slowly before continuing. According to him, the copies didn't immediately behave like real people. At first, they simply wandered through the house at night, repeating the same routines their originals had created during the day. Walking the hallway, standing in the kitchen, sitting on the couch. But over time, something changed. The copies began noticing things, the way doors worked, the way light switches controlled the rooms, the way the front door unlocked. Eventually, curiosity took over, the same curiosity that had brought every owner into the attic at some point. One night, a copy opened the front door, just slightly, then closed it again. A few nights later, it opened the door all the way and stood there for several minutes as if studying the darkness outside. The first time, one of them actually stepped out onto the porch. The man said he had been watching from the staircase. He described the moment carefully, almost like someone recalling a strange dream. The copy had looked exactly like him. Same clothes, same posture, same slow movements. The only difference was the way it looked around. Confused, as if the outside world was unfamiliar territory. It stood on the porch for nearly a minute before stepping back inside and closing the door again. After that, the copies began spending more time near the entrance, watching the street, watching the neighboring houses, learning. That was when the man finally understood the real danger the house created. The copies weren't just repeating routines, they were improving them. Every version that formed inside the house was slightly more aware than the last, more confident, more capable of passing for the real person. I asked him what eventually happened to the owners who left the house, the ones who moved away. He hesitated before answering that. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. He said most of them probably believed they had escaped, but if a copy had already learned enough to walk outside the house, there was no guarantee which version had actually left, because by the time someone decided to move away, the house might already have created a better replacement. And as he finished saying that, a new sound drifted up from the hallway below. Footsteps. 2 separate sets, walking slowly toward the attic ladder. The footsteps below the attic were unmistakable this time. 2 separate rhythms, one slightly heavier than the other, both moving slowly through the hallway beneath the hatch. The man standing across from me tilted his head slightly, listening in the same way someone listens to distant thunder before a storm arrives. Then he nodded once, quietly, almost like he had been expecting this moment. The sounds below moved closer to the ladder. One set of footsteps stopped directly beneath the attic opening. The other continued down the hallway for a few seconds before pausing, somewhere near the staircase. For a long moment, nothing else happened. Then the ladder shifted. The lowest rung creaked under pressure. Someone had stepped onto it. The man in the attic didn't move. He simply watched the opening calmly while the ladder groaned again under the weight of whoever was climbing. The first head appeared through the hatch a few seconds later, and when I saw the face, every muscle in my body locked in place. It was me. Not someone who looked similar, not someone who shared certain features. The person climbing the ladder had my exact face, my exact expression, the same clothes I'd been wearing earlier that evening. Even the same small stain on the sleeve of my jacket from when I had spilled coffee that morning. The copy climbed slowly into the attic, just like the man had done earlier. Once it reached the floor, it stood there quietly, looking around the dark space. Its eyes eventually settled on me. There was no recognition in its expression, just curiosity, like it was observing something unfamiliar. Then something else appeared in the attic hatch behind it. Another head, another face, also mine. The second copy climbed up more quickly, stepping onto the attic floor beside the first one. Both of them stood there now, studying the space with slow, deliberate movements. The man beside me sighed softly, not in fear, more like the tired resignation of someone who had seen the same thing happen too many times. He explained that this was usually the stage where people finally panicked. Seeing one copy was disturbing enough. Seeing 2 meant the process had been happening much longer than anyone realized. Eventually there would be more. 3, 4, sometimes even more than that. Each version learning slightly faster than the one before it. The copies turned their attention back toward us then. And for the first time, I noticed something unsettling about their eyes. They weren't confused anymore. They were watching us carefully, as if they were already trying to decide which one of us belonged in the house and which one didn't. For several seconds, none of us moved. The 2 copies stood a few feet away in the dim attic light, watching us with the same careful attention someone might use when studying a reflection that didn't quite behave the way it should. The man beside me remained strangely calm. He had folded his arms loosely, observing the 2 figures as if he had seen this moment play out before. In a way, he probably had. The first copy tilted its head slightly, The second one shifted its weight. Small movements, but deliberate. They weren't wandering aimlessly the way the man had described earlier versions doing. These ones looked focused, aware. One of them glanced toward the rope hanging from the rafter, studying it briefly before looking back at us. Then the first copy spoke. The voice was mine. Same tone, same pitch, but there was something hollow in the way the words came out, like someone repeating a phrase they had only just learned. It said my name, quietly, testing the sound of it. I felt the tension in my chest tighten immediately. The man next to me leaned slightly closer and spoke under his breath, his voice barely louder than the creaking beams around us. He explained that the copies always reach this stage eventually. First they watched, then they started talking. And once they could speak clearly, they started making decisions. The two figures in front of us exchanged a quick glance. It wasn't a confused movement. It looked almost like an understanding passing silently between them. Then both of them stepped forward at the same time. I instinctively backed away toward the far side of the attic. The insulation shifted under my feet, sending small clouds of dust into the air. The man didn't move. He remained exactly where he stood, watching the copies approach. When they stopped a few feet away, he finally spoke to them. He told them something that made my stomach drop. He said they didn't need him anymore. According to him, the house had already created enough versions of him over the years. His part in the pattern had ended a long time ago, but the house still needed new residents, new routines, new habits to learn from. Then he gestured toward me and calmly explained that I had already lived there long enough for the process to begin, which meant the copies didn't need him anymore. They needed me. The two figures slowly turned their attention back toward me, and the way they looked at me in that moment felt less like curiosity and more like recognition. The first copy stepped closer, then the second one followed. Their movements were slow, almost cautious, like animals approaching something unfamiliar but interesting. I backed away again until my shoulders touched the slanted wall of the attic. There was nowhere left to go. The ladder behind them was the only exit. The man remained standing off to the side, watching quietly. He didn't try to help. He didn't try to interfere. Eventually he spoke again, his tone calm in a way that felt deeply unsettling. He said that most owners made the same mistake at this point. They assumed the copies wanted to harm them. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was simpler. The house didn't care which version of someone stayed inside it. It only cared that one version remained. He explained that the copies eventually reached a stage where they could function perfectly well outside the house. They could walk, talk, drive, interact with people. From the outside, no one would ever notice the difference, but the house always kept one version behind. Someone had to continue the routines. Someone had to keep living there. That was how the cycle continued. The copies stopped moving a few feet away from me. One of them studied my face closely. The other looked toward the attic hatch. Then something disturbing happened. The first copy smiled, not maliciously, just slightly, almost like it had reached a quiet understanding. Then it spoke again. This time the voice sounded clearer, more confident. It said something simple, something that made the entire situation fall into place. It said the house was almost finished with me. Then both copies turned toward the ladder and began climbing down. For several seconds, I just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I looked toward the man. He was staring at the ladder too. Then he gave a tired sigh. He said that once the copies started leaving the attic, it meant they had already chosen which version of me they wanted to keep. The copies disappeared down the ladder one after the other. Their footsteps echoed through the hallway below as they moved across the second floor. Neither of us spoke while we listened. After a moment, the man walked slowly toward the attic and looked down. I stayed where I was. Part of me didn't want to see what was happening downstairs, but the sounds carried clearly enough. 2 sets of footsteps moving through the hallway, a bedroom door opening, a few seconds of silence. Then the front door downstairs creaked faintly. The man nodded quietly, just like that, as if everything was proceeding exactly the way he expected. He stepped back from the ladder and looked at me. Then he explained something I hadn't fully understood yet. The house didn't create copies randomly. It created them in stages. Each version learned more about the outside world than the last. The earlier copies were crude, unstable, not ready to leave. But once the house had observed someone long enough, it created versions capable of replacing them. Versions that could continue living outside, while the original remained behind. I asked him what happened to the people who stayed, the ones the house kept. He glanced toward the rope again. Then he said something much worse. He said the house didn't keep people alive. It only kept their routines, their habits, their movements. Eventually, the person left behind stopped being anything recognizable. They just became another presence walking through the rooms at night. Another set of footsteps in the hallway. Another shadow passing the bedroom doors. Eventually, new owners moved in, and the process started all over again. I felt the weight of what he was saying settle into my chest slowly. Downstairs, a car engine started. One of the copies had reached my truck. The man nodded toward the ladder. Then he said something that made the final part of the situation painfully clear. He said the copy leaving the house tonight would probably live the rest of my life without ever knowing the difference. Friends, family, work, everything. Meanwhile, the real versions of me would stay here, learning the same routines the other shadows had learned, walking the same hallway at night, opening the same doors, until the next owner arrived. I ran for the ladder, not thinking, just moving. By the time I reached the hallway downstairs, the front door was already open. Cold night air drifted inside. The sound of my truck driving away faded down the road outside. I stepped onto the porch and watched the red tail lights disappear into the darkness at the end of the street. For a moment, I stood there breathing heavily, trying to convince myself the nightmare was over. Maybe the copy leaving the house meant the process had ended. Maybe the house didn't need me anymore. Then I heard something behind me. More footsteps, then another, and another, moving slowly across the floor above. The realization settled over me slowly as I stood there in the open doorway. The copies leaving the house weren't replacements. They were just new branches. The house wasn't choosing one version to keep. It was keeping all of them. Every routine, every movement, every habit. Layer after layer of people repeating the same lives inside the same walls. And the moment I stepped back inside the house, the front door slowly closed behind me. The lock turned on its own. Somewhere upstairs, another set of footsteps began walking the hallway. And this time, I recognized the rhythm immediately. because they sounded exactly like mine.